The door clicked shut behind me, momentarily isolating me from the outside chaos. I stood there, letting the stillness of my apartment envelop me like a bomb. It had been one of those days that left me completely drained, feeling like a battery overdue for a recharge. In reality, it hadn't just been a long day, it had been a grueling month since Michael ended things. My life had become a series of moments tied together by exhaustion and emotional turmoil. The breakup wasn't dramatic or explosive. Michael had simply sat me down one evening, looked me in the eye, and told me he didn't see a future for us. His voice was calm, almost clinical, as if he were delivering a weather forecast. Rain tomorrow, partly cloudy, no chance of forever. It wasn't his words that hurt the most, but the silence that followed. No second guessing, no attempts to hold on, just a quiet resignation that left me feeling hollow. I had replayed that moment countless times, analyzing every detail, wondering if there was something I could have said or done to change the outcome. But the answer was always the same. Michael had made up his mind, and there was nothing left for me to hold on to. Since then, I had thrown myself into work, staying late at the office and volunteering for projects I didn't care about, anything to avoid the silence that greeted me each night. I did anything to keep my mind from wandering back to Michael, to us, to what we used to be. Tonight, however, I couldn't ignore the emptiness any longer. The apartment felt different, too quiet, too still. It was strange how a space could change when someone left, even if they'd barely been there. Michael had never really liked spending time at my place, always finding excuses to meet at his apartment or somewhere neutral. Now, in his absence, I realized how much of myself I had invested in someone who was never truly present. I slipped off my heels and set my bag down by the door, wincing as the straps dug into my shoulder. With a sigh, I headed toward the living room, my mind already forming a plan for the evening. A hot shower, a glass of wine, and maybe a half-hearted attempt to lose myself in a book I'd been meaning to finish for weeks. As I turned the corner into the living room, my thoughts abruptly stopped. Ethan was there. I blinked in surprise, seeing my younger brother sitting behind the couch with his laptop on his knees. He didn't notice me at first, his attention fixed on the screen. The faint glow from the monitor highlighted the furrow in his brow and the tight set of his jaw. I called out his name, my voice breaking the stillness. He jumped, his body tensing as if I'd caught him doing something he didn't want me to see. His hand swiftly slammed the laptop shut with a loud clap that echoed through the room. He sat frozen, his wide eyes meeting mine with a mix of guilt and panic. One hand disappeared into his pocket, the movement quick and deliberate, heightening my curiosity. He stammered a greeting, clearly flustered. I expressed my surprise at finding him there, noting that his presence startled me. He mentioned stopping by without thinking I'd mind, but his eyes dropped to the floor, and neither of us spoke for a moment. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Ethan was usually so laid back, so unbothered, but now his demeanor screamed discomfort. I inquired about what he was working on, pointing to the now-closed laptop. His response was vague, mentioning it was just some work stuff, and that he was getting a head start on next week. His answer didn't sit right with me, but I decided not to push him, not yet. The last thing I wanted was to turn a quiet evening into an interrogation. Still, a flicker of suspicion lingered in the back of my mind. He nodded stiffly and shifted in his seat, angling himself away from me as though trying to shield a secret. I watched him for a moment before heading toward the kitchen, wondering if I was just overthinking things. As I approached the couch, Ethan suddenly stood up, his movements sharp and startled. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path, and insisted I shouldn't sit there. His eyes darted to the couch and back to me, his expression uneasy. Confused, I questioned why not, but he denied spilling anything, instead suggesting I sit in the armchair where it was probably warmer. My gaze drifted downward, noticing an odd bulge in his jeans. I questioned him slowly, narrowing my eyes, but he brushed it off. His words rushed and defensive. The air between us felt charged, tense, and I crossed my arms, leaning against the couch's back, studying him. His jittery demeanor and evasive tone didn't feel like him. Deciding to let it go for now, I accepted his explanation, though skepticism lingered. His shoulders relaxed slightly, though his posture remained tense. I moved to sit on the edge of the couch's armrest, catching a faint twitch of his lips, a flicker of relief or gratitude, perhaps. Trying to lighten the mood, I inquired about his visit, joking about his mysterious work stuff. He laughed awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck, admitting he just wanted to hang out since it had been a while. His words took me by surprise, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. Since the breakup with Michael, I had been so consumed by my own thoughts and emotions that I hadn't given much attention to anyone else, not even Ethan. I expressed my gladness that he was there, noting it was nice to have company. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor, and echoed that it was nice to have company as well. There was a pause, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. It felt like the kind of quiet that needed to be filled, but neither of us knew how to start. We lingered in it, unspoken words hanging in the air. Eventually, I broke the silence, asking if everything was okay since he seemed different that night. He glanced up at me, his expression uneasy, and replied that he was fine but admitted it had been a weird day. His words felt like an understatement, but I didn't press him. Instead, I leaned in slightly, trying to bridge the invisible gap between us, assuring him he could talk to me about anything. In that moment, something unspoken passed between us. It wasn't the usual sibling camaraderie or even the guarded honesty we sometimes shared. It was deeper, more charged, like a current of emotion neither of us fully understood. He whispered his thanks, and the intimacy of the moment startled me. It felt as though the room had shrunk around us, the rest of the world fading into the background. My pulse quickened, a faint warmth spreading through my chest. I began to speak, but the words died on my lips as he took a small step closer. Our proximity felt electric, every breath and glance magnified. His gaze flickered down and back up, showing hesitation, uncertainty, maybe even fear. Before I could process it, he leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was fleeting and tentative, as if testing the boundaries of something neither of us fully understood. His lips brushed mine softly for a moment before he pulled away, his eyes wide with surprise and apology. He started to speak, but I interrupted him, assuring him it was okay, though my heart was racing and my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He stepped back, his face flushed, and for a moment, neither of us knew what to say. The weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the air, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. Despite the confusion, guilt, and a flood of emotions I couldn't name, a part of me couldn't deny the truth. Something between us had changed, and there was no going back. The kiss lingered on my lips, not in sensation, but in memory, replaying like a moment caught in a loop. I stared at the empty space Ethan had just vacated, the sound of his hurried footsteps echoing down the hall. He hadn't said a word, just left, his face a storm of emotions I couldn't untangle. Now I was alone, my body sinking back against the couch, as if my legs could no longer support me. My breath came shallow and uneven, thoughts racing in chaotic spirals. What had just happened? How had we crossed a line I didn't even know existed? I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to make sense of it all, but the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. The kiss had been brief and tentative, yet it felt monumental, as if the entire foundation of our relationship had shifted in an instant. Guilt was the first feeling to surface. How could I have let this happen? Ethan was my brother. We'd grown up together, shared childhood memories, and navigated life side by side. This wasn't just a breach of boundaries. It was a violation of everything that had defined us. But beneath the guilt, something else stirred. It wasn't easy to name a pull, an ache, an unspoken question that refused to go away. It wasn't desire exactly, but something just as powerful. Perhaps it was a closeness I hadn't realized I craved until that moment. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought, but it clung to me like a stubborn shadow. What did this mean for him? For me? For us? The days that followed were a strange blur of normalcy and tension, each moment teetering on the edge of familiarity and something unspoken. Ethan avoided me at first, keeping his distance as though proximity alone might bring us back to that forbidden moment. But even in his absence, I felt his presence like the echo of a sound that refused to fade. Gradually, he began seeking me out again. It started small, an offhand comment as he passed me in the kitchen, a casual question about a show we used to watch together. His demeanor was different, though softer, more vulnerable, as if he were reaching out, testing the waters to see if I'd pull away. I didn't. Instead, I responded kindly, our conversations growing longer, more frequent, and more personal. He'd linger in the doorway of my room, asking about my day in a way that felt less like polite interest and more like genuine care. I noticed the way he seemed to relax around me, the way his guarded edges softened when we talked. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Ethan turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper, asking if he could talk to me about something. I encouraged him, and he hesitated, fidgeting with the hem of his sweatshirt before asking if I ever felt like I didn't know where I belonged, like I was just drifting. The question caught me off guard, but also struck a chord. I thought about the breakup with Michael, the emptiness that had followed, and the sense of being untethered in my own life. I admitted that I thought everyone felt that way sometimes. He nodded, his gaze fixed on a spot beyond the TV, and expressed that lately, it felt like everything was changing, and he couldn't keep up, feeling like he wasn't enough. His words hit me harder than I expected. I reached out, placing a hand on his arm, reassuring him that he was enough and always had been. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name, gratitude, maybe, or hope. His thanks meant a lot, and the intimacy of the moment felt different, like the room had shrunk around us, the rest of the world fading into the background. My pulse quickened, a faint warmth spreading through my chest, and I found myself unable to resist the connection that had developed between us. As the movie played on, neither of us spoke again, but the silence felt different now, less like a void, and more like a bridge connecting us in ways I hadn't considered. Though I still didn't fully understand what was happening between us, one thing was clear. We were closer now, bound by something neither of us could quite define. And for better or worse, I wasn't ready to let it go. Later, the sound of silverware clinking and the soft hum of the radio filled the quiet kitchen as Ethan and I sat across from each other at the dinner table. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple meal of pasta and salad, but there was a warmth to the moment that felt different, more meaningful. He thanked me for making dinner, and I responded with a smile, noting how nice it was to have someone to cook for. He hesitated before adding his gratitude for everything else I had done for him. I furrowed my brow slightly, seeking clarification, and he explained that I had been there for him when he needed it most, something he didn't think I had ever acknowledged. His vulnerability caught me off guard, but also filled me with a quiet sense of pride. I assured him that he didn't have to thank me for that, that's what family was for. He nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful, and shared that he had been thinking a lot about Dad and how things had been between them. He expressed feeling like he couldn't live up to Dad's expectations, feeling constantly criticized and never good enough. My heart ached for him. I had always known that Ethan and our father, Paul, had a strained relationship, but hearing him express it so openly was new. I apologized for how he felt and suggested that he might be too hard on himself, believing that Dad did see him differently than he thought. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and admitted that he didn't know how to talk to Dad about it every time he tried. It felt like he hit a wall. I encouraged him to tell Dad exactly how he felt, not just what he thought Dad wanted to hear, but the truth itself. He admitted he wouldn't know where to start, and I reached across the table, offering my support. I told him he didn't have to do it alone and offered to be there when he talked to Dad, assuring him that I would help in any way I could. He looked at me with a flicker of gratitude, and I reaffirmed my willingness to support him, reminding him that Dad loved him, and sometimes people just need a nudge to show it. A few days later, the conversation with Paul took place in the living room, a space where so much had already happened between Ethan and me. Paul sat in his favorite armchair, his face creased with curiosity as Ethan and I joined him. Ethan began nervously, expressing that he needed to talk about something important. Paul leaned forward, signaling his readiness to listen. What followed was a conversation unlike any I had ever witnessed. Ethan spoke openly, sharing his fears, frustrations, and the burden of feeling like he'd never measured up. His voice wavered at times, but he persisted, laying bare years of bottled-up emotions. To my surprise, Paul didn't interrupt or deflect. He listened intently, his gaze fixed on Ethan. When it was Paul's turn to speak, his words were calm and measured. He admitted that he had never realized how Ethan felt, and that he thought he was pushing him to be his best without considering how it was affecting him. He offered a sincere apology, something that hung in the air, raw and unexpected. Ethan blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly, but Paul continued, assuring him that he didn't have to be sorry and that he just needed Paul to hear him. Paul promised to do better moving forward. Paul then suggested a family walk in the local park, a place we hadn't visited together in years. The day was bright and crisp. Perfect weather that made everything feel a little lighter. We strolled along the winding paths, pausing to admire the autumn leaves and laugh at old family memories. At one point, Ethan and Paul spontaneously played catch with a stray frisbee, their laughter echoing through the trees. Watching them, I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of hope and healing weaving itself into the fabric of our family. By the time we returned home, Ethan looked more at ease than I had seen him in months, maybe years. He smiled more, joked more, and seemed genuinely happy. For the first time, I saw Paul make an effort to support Ethan in the ways he needed, not just the ways Paul thought were right. In the weeks that followed, the changes in Ethan were impossible to ignore. He carried himself differently, with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He seemed lighter, freer, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The dynamic within our family felt healthier, too. Conversations flowed more easily, and lingering tensions began to dissolve. I watched as Ethan and Paul worked to rebuild their relationship, brick by brick. I couldn't help but feel proud of both of them. One evening, as I sat in my room reflecting on everything that had happened, a sense of gratitude washed over me. The path to this moment hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. We had come so far as a family, and I knew we had the strength to keep moving forward together.